So thank you for coming to the first panel of the Small Data, Big Trends, and Little Ends. So I'm the moderator for this panel. My name is Tricia Wang, and I am a fellow here at Berkman Center at Harvard, and I also have a consulting firm where we work with companies on integrating big data methods into their big data techniques. So I'm really excited to welcome you guys here, and I'm going to actually start off this amazing panel by, let's see, first we have to find out if our clicker works. Can I get help from the tech? More, just we can get this to, I'll keep going as I do this. Okay, so I'm going to start off by actually reading you guys a poem that I have rewritten. The original is on the left side, and this is a rewrite of an ancient Chinese Taoist poem where you'll see it's when people see some data as big, other data becomes small. And when people see some data as small, other things become big. Qualitative and quantitative create each other. Statistical significance and meaningful insights support each other. Gigantic ends and teensy ends define each other. Massive samples and selective samples depend on each other. Questions and analysis follow each other. Therefore, the master researcher acts without judging the data and finds the best research method depending on the research questions at task. So it just so happens today that all of our panelists here have questions where the best method to answer I'm just going to play along here as we try with the clicker, the best method to answer their questions was through the use of small sample sizes. So instead of tackling their research questions with using quantitative methods to get a really big N, they felt that the best methods was to actually get a really small sample size, but to get really deep meaning, stories, and depth. So they weren't searching for statistical significance, they were looking for meaningful insights. And all of our panelists here have relied on human learning, not machine learning. They didn't think that computational power programming would be the best way forward, but they relied on their own human learning techniques. So we have four panelists who will speak about their research here. And I want to just remind you guys that we will all have 10 minutes each to present, and I will wave my magical whip when we reach 10 minutes. So we will keep this moving. I think we may cut into some Q&A time, but I think it's fine because we have really great presentations for you today. And what I want to emphasize here is that you're going to see some overarching themes to help you start seeing some of the connections gel, is that everyone here is going to talk a little bit about, hit on the topics of identity and how our identity is shaped in different ways through online practices. And you're going to hear really interesting things about how these creative practices happen on the ground when you actually just start living with people. So all four people here are not just theorizing actually in the web and in the clouds, they actually spend time on the ground. Tony has spent a lot of time with gamers on Minecraft. Molly has spent a lot of time with people who are grieving people who have passed away on Facebook. And Lesley here has spent a lot of time on looking at how young people are creating digital practices for education. And Tim is also looking at how people pass away through suicide and how they recreate their identity in suicide notes. And we have also, Lindsay, our hashtag moderator. So I want to remind you guys that we will be on the back channel. If you have questions, please make sure you use the hashtag C1 for this panel and also include the hashtag TTW14. And are there any questions before we go forward, I think? Well, let's start. Okay, so why don't we start first, I think, with Molly, right? Or no, we're going to start with happiness first. We're not going to go into death. We're going to end on death today, but that's where we're going to leave you a bit sad. But we're going to start on happiness first. We're going to start with games. So Tony's going to come up and talk about his research. And Tony spent a long time with people who play Minecraft. And he's going to tell you a bit about Minecraft. But what I think is really interesting is that he's going to tell you about some of the things that he observed how online interactions actually have real-world economic and social implications. And I think in our discussions, one of the most interesting things that he told me was when he was observing how Minecraft users, when they're playing, they're actually using their voices to talk to each other. So there is no sense of true anonymity, that the players are always bringing a sense of their identity into the game. So as Tony presents his work, let's welcome him and pay attention to all the amazing stories he's going to tell.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm really excited to be part of this panel. Just hearing about all the research, sounds like we have a lot of really great research being done here. So my work represents synthesis between game studies, ethnography, and new media literacy studies. This research was inspired by my desire to better understand the way that players interact in the vibrant digital spaces that form around modern games. So digital games have been repeatedly shown to be valuable learning environments, but in considering the persistent conflicts relating to both race and gender in these spaces, we have to critically question how equally available these learning experiences are to all players. So the work represented in this talk is an effort to understand the lived experience of a young African-American Minecraft player and the way that he negotiates the aspects of himself which aren't directly represented through gameplay such as race, class, and ethnicity. I've approached my research with a methodology known as Connective ethnography, which seeks to draw connections between participants' activities both on and offline. So my work developed from an interest in what's been termed as the metagame aspect of digital gameplay, or in other words, the spaces which form to support gameplay outside of the game itself. Examples of this would include things like forums where players discuss gameplay strategies or how to build their character, or maybe like a wiki which would serve as a gameplay manual. All of these platforms are fan-produced, although they may have some involvement with the official producers and developers of the game. And one framework which has been used to conceptualize these spaces is the Affinity Space. Affinity Spaces describe environments where people with shared interests, in this case a specific digital game, share information and engage in informal interest-driven learning with one another. Okay. So to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework behind this, the idea of Affinity Spaces comes out of a similar earlier framework known as the community of practice. The central aspect of community practice is the idea of membership or belonging, with members of the community being trained through a specific set of skills through what's called legitimate peripheral participation. They start off with a small aspect of the skill, and they move to more central, more holistic aspects of it. So this was founded out of study of communities which are deeply embedded in their cultural systems, like the midwives of Aztec tribes, or the hierarchical and tradition-bound Navy quartermaster training system. So in response to this, a literacy researcher named James G. Established Affinity Spaces as a pivot away from what he saw as an overuse of communities of practice in places where there weren't actually clear ideas of membership, clear ideas of belonging, or clear ideas of communities. So for example, online interactions where there's like a fluid membership, there aren't really strong identities of belonging, in his view, weren't really an accurate way to apply ideas of community. So instead there's the Affinity Space, which instead focuses on what the space affords, how players how users talk to each other, and how they interact in the space. So Affinity Spaces provides great analytic power for explaining interactions in fluid, modern online environments. So a key aspect of Affinity Spaces is the idea that users' background issues, like their ethnicity and gender, which would typically be key aspects to memberships in a community, and they use them strategically if they use them at all. So this idea struck me as problematic, especially with my experience in these spaces as a gamer myself, and my knowledge of the often contentious, insular, and hostile nature of these spaces. So this urge to problematize Affinity Space interactions falls with a larger trend in game studies, which seeks to understand games as objects of culture beyond considering them as isolated texts. So this drove my research question: how do background aspects of a participant's life influence the way that they interact in an Affinity Space? I picked Minecraft because it represents an interesting context of study. It generates a great deal of this fan-produced content of these Affinity Spaces. And I first met Ben, my primary participant, through an after-school program I'm a GA for called Identity, which focuses on engaging middle school youth with STEM topics through a variety of narrative and new media activities. Ben is a 14-year-old African-American youth who lives in a large inner-city neighborhood of lower socioeconomic status with his grandmother, grandfather, a younger brother, 2 older sisters, and his aunt and uncle. And overall perspectives like Ben's are underrepresented in game studies research. So through our relationship in the after-school program, I realized that Ben is an active participant in spaces dedicated to Minecraft. and both his status as a producer and a consumer in these spaces and our strong friendship through the program drove my decision to focus on Ben as my primary participant. So this relationship provided me with entree to a larger group of Minecraft players and a perspective on the lived reality of Minecraft gameplay. So my theoretical framework and my research question led me towards a methodology known as Connective ethnography, which, like traditional ethnography, is a way of generating a rich description of a culture-sharing group. And as in traditional ethnography, the researcher acts as both participant and observer. However, in Connective ethnography, the focus is on interaction online as a social practice, which is constructed across all spheres of the participant's life. So for data collection, I tried to get data from Ben's life at school, his life at home, and also his life in gameplay. So one of the primary findings of my work was understanding how Ben moves through various spaces to pursue gameplay. Gameplay largely takes place on servers which are created by other players, hosted on paid services, which guarantees a certain degree of protection for hackers. These servers tend to be constructed by administrators who patch together numerous player-made modifications to enhance core gameplay and construct the essential architecture of the server, like shops, hubs, stuff like that. So gameplay also tends to be recorded to serve as content on YouTube, largely taking the form of narrated Let's Plays. And YouTube participation tends to also be expensive. It requires expensive hardware due to the resource-intensive nature of streaming, recording, or playing and recording at the same time. Ben sees YouTube production as a way to make money and to obtain financial independence for running his own servers and gaining better access to recording hardware. So all gameplay is supported by voice communication over Skype. Ben will often meet other players he enjoys playing with and add them to a Skype network. These players then serve as part of Ben's support network in creating servers and playing online. So one side effect of Skype becoming the primary communication channel is that it tends to blur the line between gameplay on the screen and life offline, which I'll describe in a vignette in just a minute. So throughout Ben's time as a Minecraft player, he's moved from sort of like a hacker, from an outsider, to being an active creator of these servers. So since my data collection spanned multiple spheres of Ben's life, I was able to construct a story of Ben's progression as a player within these spaces and to understand how the background aspects of his life moved into the foreground in gameplay. So by synthesizing field notes, record interaction, and both formal and informal interviews, I was able to kind of construct a story of his history of play. So as a server administrator, Ben's responsible for configuring a number of modifications to work correctly, designing the player experience, and most importantly, organizing a team of players to kind of build the architecture for the server. So this is called a build team, and it's made up of players that Ben trusts and respects the counts of. So about halfway through my data collection, Ben invited me to be part of a build team with the goal of assembling the architecture for a new server project that he was working on. And during this build session, another player joined us named Decker. He was consistently sort of abrasive throughout. Ben and him had a half friend, half antagonist relationship. And this kind of came to the fore when Ben's grandmother could be heard over the background in the Skype call. And Decker commented, "Whose ghetto mom is that? I think we all know." So later, Decker responds with shock to learn that another player on the team is Hispanic. He says that he thought he could tell when someone was white by the sound of their voice. He also comments on my age because they've been discussing a rapper, and he said that he knows that I'm old because I'm not familiar with the rapper they were discussing. That's kind of funny, actually. So Decker then effectively calls the build team to end by continually making unwelcome advances towards a female member of the team, and finally using a gender insult, which kind of decline these advances. So in this example, we can see strategic negotiation of background aspects. So for Ben, Decker represents a valuable part of his network as both a builder, but also as a co-owner on a different server project later. So Ben is able to negotiate Decker's unpleasant racism, initially brought to the foreground by the voice nature of Skype technology. However, the other player, Melissa, who had been positioned as less skillful and without the benefit of owning her own server, is either unable or unwilling to negotiate similar harassment due to her gender. And she ends up leaving both the build call, or both the Skype call and the build team. So through Ben's activities here, he's basically participating as an activity that's related to game design. When I asked him what he wanted to do as he got older, he said that he wanted to be a game designer. So what this represents is sort of economic fairness in addition to fair play. So through understanding the way that these background aspects are negotiated, we can understand how we can better design game experiences which fit with all players and provide these opportunities for them as well. All right, thank you.
Is where she was telling us about this moment where a participant actually took a photo of herself with an iPad in a Ziploc bag while she is bathing in a bathtub and studying. And that was her way of study prep. So I think, Lesley, you'll be telling us more about that. And I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint in the meantime. And right now, whoever else wants to answer their phone, and then we'll start. And this is Lesley's Twitter handle. And we will move forward to your presentation, Lesley. Do you want to come up?
That's awesome. That was my phone ringing, by the way.
Oh, that's your phone? You should have answered it. There was time.
I should have answered it, I know. Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. And before I start, I should emphasise that this project was actually a shared project with my colleague Martin Oliver, also at the Institute of Education in the University of London. So it's very much been a joint piece of work. I want to focus on particular aspects from a theoretical point of view, obviously given the theme of the conference. And my title, I hope, conveys some of that kind of focus that I want to look at today. And I should apologise for my voice. I've got the remains of a cold. I might be coughing a little bit, so I hope you can hear me okay, yeah? Is it all right? Okay. In a 2004 paper, Bruno Latour discussed what he saw as a disturbing tendency for doubt, radical doubt and critique to be over-applied and also to be co-opted. And he talked in particular about right-wing conspiracy theory and also the undermining of arguments around environmentalism in particular. And in that discussion, he compared this whole sort of what he regarded as a kind of an inappropriate co-option of that set of theoretical perspectives to what he called it, like the results of a quick reading of theorists such as Bourdieu. And in doing that, he speculated that it's the same appeal to powerful agents hidden in the dark, acting always consistently, continuously and relentlessly. Of course, he says, we in the Academy like to use more elevated causes: society, discourse, knowledge/power, fields of forces, empires, capitalism, while conspiracists like to portray a miserable bunch of greedy people with dark intents. But he goes on to say, I find something troublingly similar in the structure of the explanation, in the first movement of disbelief, and then in the wheeling of causal explanations coming out of the deep dark below. So he's got quite a colourful way of describing this idea. So, in this paper, in this paper, I want to use this kind of challenge that Latour brings out as a starting point to consider how the digital is conceptualised within education, looking in particular at the example of the open educational resources movement and how it's being used in that context. Latour is arguing that popular political critique and academic critique are increasingly using the same set of tools, those of disbelief, deconstruction and relativism, in order to undermine and to challenge powerful dominating structures or ideas. And arguably, we could say the objects of such critique, both in the political and the academic setting, are going to be regarded as large-scale and also monolithic in their nature. Now, I think this is interesting, and I find his analysis quite persuasive and thought-provoking, but I'd like to examine the comparison a bit more closely, because it doesn't really work in my particular research context, and it made me think about whether we can push that consideration a bit further forward. So I think Latour's got a point in saying that academic critique has adopted, obviously, a standpoint of radical scepticism, and his slightly tongue-in-cheek remarks, another quote that I'm going to read, quoting, he says, "Entire PhD programmes are running in order to teach the hard way that facts are made up, that there's no such thing as natural, unmediated, unbiased access to truth, and that we are always prisoners of language, and that we always speak from a particular standpoint." So he's being a little bit sarcastic there, but I think that's quite an interesting point that he's making. So, I can turn my page. Now, from the perspective of education, I want to argue that the role and the function of critique in educational research is a bit more complex, and I think it should be more complex than this characterisation that he's making. Perhaps owing to its admittedly kind of troubled relationship with empirical social science in particular. An education critique seeks, I would argue, to position itself as a counterpoint to oversimplistic thinking, with common objects of critique being a different type of monolith. Generalisations, unsubstantiated yet dominant discourses in the guise of theory, questionable ideological binaries, and so on. So the object of analysis is the field itself, to some extent, and the ideas of the field itself. And a blunt and questionable theoretical apparatus like the type that Latour was talking about is not necessarily going to be particularly helpful. It's much more, I would argue, helpful to look at critique as a means by which to question those kind of blunt theories in educational research policy and practice. And it strikes me that the latter form of critique, the one that I'm trying to describe, is striving towards a more nuanced stance rather than a simple statement of it's all about power. Okay. So the argument I want to make is that certain strands of contemporary critique, while appearing to oppose large-scale operations of power, in fact rely on a fantasy of an all-powerful panoptic apparatus. Although this vision might be conventionally regarded as a form of dystopia, as in the dark vision conjured by Latour, I would propose that these positions are in fact based on a fundamentally utopian belief in the potential for society based on absolute power and efficiency. In this respect, this form of critique might be seen as actually serving to reinforce and underscore a belief in the simple, the unnuanced and the convergent, the unchanging and the absolute. It appears as if notions of the apocalyptic, cataclysmic and dystopian are somehow entangled with the notion of utopia and collapsed, and the two become collapsed, they start collapsing into a fantasy of absolutism, as opposed to a critical position which acknowledges the situated and emergent nature of social practice. And I think it's really interesting if you look into the etymology. I was really quite surprised by this, of the word utopia. Apparently it comes from two different Greek words, one of which means good place, but the other one means no place. And it's this concept of no place that I'd like to explore a little bit more in this analysis. And it reminds me of a book from a few years ago, Mark Roget's Non-Places. And what I want to argue is this utopian-dystopian binary is relevant, I think, to this notion of the non-place. And it's particularly relevant to the discourses surrounding digital education, which tend to be characterised by a tendency, by a kind of collapse into a binary of either digital, brave new world, utopian discourses, invoking the production of the graduate as this sort of neoliberal product, this perfect neoliberal subject, ready for the challenges of the knowledge economy. Or alternatively, we see a dystopian kind of moral panic discourse in digital education about collapsing standards, burgeoning plagiarism, lack of attention and dumbing down. So we've got these two extremes that tend to be invoked in those discourses. And what I would argue is, in both of those discourses, it seems to me that the university is reduced to a liminal site, a transit site, an abstraction, and that reminds me of Augier's analysis of the non-places of supermodernity, which are stripped of situatedness and materiality. As the etymology suggests, it's a no place, a non-place. So the digital university is rendered as pure ideology, free-floating and disconnected from the day-to-day nature of social practice. Okay. So this tendency, I want to argue, is very prevalent in open educational research in particular, and the discourses surrounding it. And we see a collapse into that binary very strongly in that discourse. The university's position as representative of elitism, privilege, reproductive privilege, exclusionary, hierarchical. But however, as Jeremy Knox has pointed out, quote, in defining the object of education to the enhancement of human life, the OER movement tends to naturalise archetypal human condition, a set of idealised qualities in which learners are expected to adhere. So very briefly, our study findings, it's right there, I don't want to use up too much time, basically undermine this concept of the binary that I was discussing, this utopian dystopian collapse. In the study, what we saw was a very different type of picture. As Tricia mentioned, it was a one-year ethnographic study using visual methodologies. And very briefly, as you can see, what we found in the student practices was a very, very strongly shifting, agentive, extremely situated, emergent, contingent sort of situation which was constantly in flux. And it really undermined, just in conclusion, there was a constant remaking, making, remixing of repertoires in a very intimate relationship with non-human actors in the form of devices and material artifacts and tools. So in conclusion, I think we need to develop our notions of critique much more nuanced and much more nuanced fashion in order to theorise agency based on situated practice to avoid collapsing into ideological binaries based on utopian and dystopian thinking. Thank you.
With the people's interactions with it. So some of the theoretical framework that I used to inform this study, first the term thanatechnology. So thanatology is the study of death and grief, but Karla Sofka decided to use this term thanatechnology in the 90s, and at first she was talking about how people use computers, for instance, to study death, not necessarily what happens when someone dies online. Later on, she amended this definition to include how people's digital identities end up impacting the way that we study death. So thanatechnology really is important because it's how technology changes our understanding of death and grief, and that's what I was most interested in studying in this process. So I also was using the ideas of online communities and how people can turn to Facebook to have this online community that's already built in around somebody's profile, and what it means when we're involved with this networked public. So the Facebook profile is public in a way. There's this context collapse of all of these people, your family, your coworkers, your friends, and how does the Facebook profile as a network public impact the way that we grieve? So just for a little context, online grieving isn't new. There's this site, the Worldwide Cemetery, was created in 1995. And this is actually a recent screenshot, so it hasn't really changed that much. But you can see now there's a new add a separate page with family photos. And this is a place where internet users can erect permanent monuments to the dead. And I think a Facebook profile basically acts in the same way, but it's something that we've already created for ourselves. It's our own permanent monument. And then people can start contributing to that after we die. But you know, the photos are already there. We don't have to go make a separate page. So there's a difference there that I wanted to explore. After looking at the Worldwide Cemetery, I think making this a little bit more social, My Death Space was created. You'll see up here, this is a map of people that have died and people's profiles that people have, the bereaved have set up in this person's honor. So again, this is something that somebody has created after somebody has died in memory of them. But what I was really interested in was how somebody's Facebook profile then is used as a monument. So my research questions were phenomenological. I really was interested in understanding how a Facebook user experiences grief and experiences interaction with that profile. So I wanted to talk to people about their own experiences with a profile of somebody who had died. So I was also specifically interested in young adults experiencing the expression of grief because young adults in what we would maybe call traditional grieving processes, they don't necessarily have a place to express grief. If you are a student and you're at college and you're away from your home and your friend from home passes away, you might not be able to fly home to go to their funeral, or you might not actually be invited to that funeral. So they can traditionally be marginalized in the grieving process when we look at grief studies and things like that. So I wanted to talk to young adults about their experiences in this new forum that they have in order to, that's something that could be new. Also, I think that I wanted to explore the way that people are memorialized just specifically on their Facebook profiles and maybe not just in stories that we tell about them. So again, I did a phenomenological study. I wanted to understand how people were feeling and really shed some light on personal experiences that people had. I conducted 20 in-depth interviews with these students, and as a result of those interviews, I then looked at the interview transcripts and was looking for emergent themes. So I didn't necessarily go in with predetermined codes looking for specific things in those transcripts, but what ended up happening was I was looking for code co-occurrence to determine what kind of things I could pull out from these transcripts and what people were talking about when I had this really fluid conversation with them about grieving and about their experiences. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about today is people, when they go to Facebook, are seeking comfort, but ultimately they may leave feeling uncomfortable, and this is the dichotomy that a lot of people that I talked to expressed. So it's technologically convenient in a way because people are able to pick up on this profile. It's so easy in terms of time and space. There isn't any limit to how people can interact with somebody's profile if they're feeling bereaved. At the same time, it can be inconvenient because that grief and the grief of other people is in your newsfeed. When you go to Facebook, maybe you don't want to be expressing grief or feeling bereaved at that time, but you'll see it in your newsfeed, especially if it's somebody who you have a lot of mutual friends.
Studies death also, but instead of looking at people who die accidentally or because of old age, whatever, Tim looks at people who intentionally die. He's looking at people who commit suicide. And I think this is like a constant strand in your research because he studies death and crisis and disaster from 9/11 to Hurricane Katrina. So in your current research, Tim's going to talk about his study of a couple of, I think, over 40 suicide notes. And one of the most fascinating stories of why Tim got into this research is when he looked at a 6-year-old man who put up his website, and it pretty much documented his entire life. And this was he put this up the moment he killed himself. And so I think this really prompted you to go into this research, and it's put you into this rabbit hole. But what's been really amazing is that he's looking at how people voluntarily extend their life after they pass away. So let's welcome Tim to the stage.
It's kind of interesting, right? The panel today is sort of mimicking the life course. We're starting out with education and games and ending up with death and grief. But I wanted to also, while we're getting set up, thank the organizing committee and all of you for coming. And So my talk is called Commemorating the Self, Online Suicide Notes as Cultural Artifacts. And I think this is the beginning of a project for me, so even figuring out what the heck cultural artifacts means, is still, or is language that might drop out. But in any case, I want to start with a question. So what happens to the soul when we die is obviously a question for theologians and philosophers, not necessarily something that I want to get into. But what happens to the self when we die, I think, is something that we are situated here to think a lot about, right? Because, today we understand the self to be a social construct, right? It's more than our physical bodies and our corporeal selves. We know it to be contextual and performative. We know it to be, not fixed or essential, but a construction that's achieved, as much through mass media or popular culture as it is through, our ties to families and communities and things that are, traditionally thought of as constituting the self, right? So this was certainly true before the internet, I think, but the internet and social networking sites have made this stuff much more explicit, I think, a more kind of explicit feature of daily life. So we know that selves are things today that we constitute online as well, that we curate for multiple audiences. And there's a lot of work to attest to that, I think. But in that case, they're also then something that, as Molly's been talking about, things that we leave behind when we die, right? A lot of people are starting to figure this out and doing great work like Molly was about, the way that our digital selves get used by others to grieve us, to mourn, to commemorate us. But all that is kind of post hoc commemoration, and it says more about how the living interact with us when we're gone than it says about, what we ourselves do at that moment, right? So I've been interested to see then how death gets represented online by people who know that they are going to die because they are going to kill themselves, and how they represent themselves in their final online public communications, their suicide notes. So I set out to see how many online suicide notes I could find, right? That was kind of the first question. Are these things available? Because it occurs to me that probably most of them are being taken down, right? It used to be difficult, I think, in the kind of early days of MySpace or something like that, to figure out what to do with someone's profile when they died, but now that stuff's pretty, I think the major companies have policies, and it might be a little cumbersome, but if you don't want something like that online, you can get it taken down. So I'm not even claiming at this point that the things that I found are necessarily representative of suicide notes online in general, but this is rather kind of what I could find on the first blush, which actually took quite a bit of time. So as you can see, there are the stats. In the interest of time, I won't read them. And then a little more about who these people were. So from September 2004 to October of 2013, that was the first and most recent one I could find. It was mainly men, which, as I understand it, is indicative of research on suicide notes, like analog suicide notes. Men are more likely to leave a note. They're more likely to be successful about suicide when they attempt it. The average age was maybe a little older than I expected initially, although one of the notes was from someone as young as 14, sadly. The notes were actually fairly short, which is also typical for analog notes as well. They tend to actually be quite short. So 26 of the 40 notes were under 500 words. And so then it's not completely surprising that the kind of most rich, at least for someone just kind of doing a close reading of these things, the most rich group were the 14 of them that were over 500 words. So of course, there has been a lot of scholarship on suicide. As you may know, Emil Durkheim basically invented the discipline of sociology, or helped to establish it with his study, comparing suicide rates across countries. So this is like that big data back before we called it that. And Edwin Schneidman was a psychologist who, in the 50s, happened upon a huge trove of suicide notes in the LA County Coroner's Office. And decided that these were kind of clues to the suicidal mind, and started basically a whole long career and began the field of suicidology with his study of these notes. So I performed a very simple discourse analysis of these online suicide notes that I found, first reading through them kind of unsystematically, and then noting the most common themes, then rereading and classifying them based on those themes. And, also at the same time reading scholarship that existed about suicide notes from people like Schneidman, from historians of suicide as well. And, what I found that in most of the notes, you found themes that you'd find in any suicide note. Mentioning loved ones, apologies to people for committing suicide, also people who felt that they weren't loved, that no one would miss them. And some of the notes then dealing with the author's legacy, the idea of how they'd be remembered, providing autobiographical details and things like that, and even a bit of people who felt wronged and were committing suicide, at least in part to, publicize that wrong. And again, these are all, or at least much of this stuff has been written about before in the context of paper suicide notes. Nevertheless, a subset of these notes did, I think, differ substantially from the rest of them in ways that point to not only some new features, I think, of suicide online, but to the larger kind of socio-cultural tensions surrounding death and selfhood in the digital age. So 14 of the notes, as you can see, contain 500 words or more, and 10 of those were written by people older than the median sample age of 27, and the average age of the longer note writers was 39. So this group of mostly older suicides wrote notes that explored, again, some of the same themes, but also explored other themes that were largely absent from the shorter notes. So Unlike the other shorter notes in the sample, 11 of these notes mentioned a concern with the legacy of the suicide, and 7 of those, or rather 11 in the whole sample and 7 in this group of larger notes, were focusing on legacy. We're providing 11 of them were providing autobiographical details, which were largely absent in the shorter notes, as you might expect. And a lot of them even were making personal, philosophical, political statements or views on what life meant and things like that, that by and large didn't happen in the short notes, and also is not a super common feature of suicide notes in general, according to scholarship. So, I started calling these, or feeling like these were commemorative suicide notes, these longer ones, and there were that were specifically about a concern for the author's legacy, were explicit about the idea of how they wanted to be remembered, right? That provided a lot of detail about the person's life, their belief system, and these things also didn't apologize by and large. They were not, so concerned with their loved ones specifically. In other words, they seemed to have a sense of an audience beyond their intimate connections, right? That they were speaking to a public who was not just, the same as people who might find a note left on in the bedroom or something, in the kind of old sense. So I want to talk a little bit in more detail about some of the, I think, richest, most interesting cases that I came upon here. And the first is Martin-Manley. So this is his website, martin-manley.org. So early in the morning of his 60th birthday, Manley drove his car into the parking lot of the local police station and fatally shot himself in the head. Later that day, a website called martin-manley.org went live. Manley had been creating the site for months, kind of quietly, not telling anyone about it, and it launched the day that he died. And he talks about paying for it to be open for 5 years. There was some controversy. Yahoo initially shut it down. People had already mirrored it by then, including like Anonymous. So if you type in Martin Manley, there's like a kind of redirect to the Anonymous hosted version of this same thing. So for Manley, his reason for ending his own life was fairly simple. He had no children who needed him. He'd accomplished a lot. He kind of is one of the fathers of like sabermetrics for basketball. If you follow it, he created one of the early like basketball efficiency metrics or something like that. He was a sports writer, kind of jack of all trades guy. But rather than waiting until he was quote unquote too old to make my own decisions, he wanted to be able to produce a record of my history, proof that I existed, right? And he worried that he was starting to lose his mental capacity. He'd seen signs of forgetfulness and things like that as he approached 60. He had some family history of senile dementia and stuff, and he thought, now's the time. And so that is his motivation there. And indeed, Manley wrote that his website may be the most detailed example of a suicide letter in history, something to be entered into the Guinness Book of Records. And elsewhere he exclaimed, "I believe I have a right to leave a documented history of my life for the world to see or ignore." So another case is Joe Baudelaire, who's a 63-year-old television producer and writer. He had worked on Saturday Night Live. He had co-authored the first draft of Wayne's World, but had fallen on kind of hard times in the industry, and had talked in his note about not, being able to get the work that he once did. So in the interest of time, I'll show you really quickly. He's, proud of all these things, and he's listing his, things from his family, but also things from his professional career. And it's a very extensive, over 3,000 word note. A third interesting case is Malachi Rooster. He was a 52-year-old photographer involved in Chicago's avant-garde music scene who set himself on fire as a form of political protest against the Iraq War and the Bush administration. And he was very concerned with how this action would be thought of and what his legacy would be and what the kind of political ramifications of this are. And so his website is in large part devoted to explaining this. And as you can see here, he's saying, "Judge me by my actions. I'm not a martyr. I'm a spiritual warrior. And our so-called leaders are the real terrorists in the world today, responsible for more deaths than Osama bin Laden." So this concern for reputation, I think, is really key to understanding what's going on here. By crafting these notes online, these suicides sought to kind of secure a legacy for themselves in a way and manage their representations and their reputations in ways that I think are reminiscent of what Gary Allen Fine talks about as being a reputational entrepreneur. And Martin-Manley, again, makes this quite explicit, right? The thought that my memory or legacy would come to an abrupt end was unacceptable to me, and in my opinion, should be unacceptable to anyone in my situation, right? So he's pretty forcefully claiming that this is not only like, he's not apologizing for doing this. I mean, he does in his note make some, say, hey, I'm sorry if anyone's bothered by this, but largely, Manley is unapologetic, right? And so I think, what's going on here is not just that you're trying to manage your reputation, but that really explicitly thinking about the self beyond the moment of death is a way of combating fears of death, right? Guys like Schneidman talked about naughtment or being oblivionated. Stannard has talked about death as cessation of self. So what I see here, and which is kind of fascinating and wonderful and also a little horrifying, is kind of death without the cessation of self, right? And what I call kind of self-preservation through self-destruction, right? You're able to kind of craft the self that you want to be remembered by, but in doing so, of course, ending your mortal life. So I think this raises some very provocative and thorny ethical and social questions, and I hope we get to discuss them momentarily. Thanks.
I think the common theme that we've seen here is really about identity, and really this brings me to my favorite sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, where he talks about liquid identity. And he talks about that, in modernity, we actually have this feeling that we're free and we have many choices. We can choose to do anything we want. We can constantly remake ourselves, but this actually places a lot of burden and responsibility on the individual. And it creates these new kind of stresses where, in order to find coherence in all of our ability to choose our own path, we have to constantly recreate our own narratives as a way to make sense of ourselves. And that's a large part of being a modern individual. And as you can see, I think in all of these stories, is that it's this complexity of how identity is even being recreated and constantly shaped even after you pass away. And even if you're not actively shaping it, others are actively engaging with it, with you, to try and shape it after. Try and make sense of your identity even after you're gone. And in the players that Tony has brought up and Lesley's brought up is that in their own work, they're not just being defined by some institution that says, gamers are this way or education is this way, but they're remaking it in their own way too. So I think this is a really nice way to tie up the panel. I'd like to open it up to questions in the audience. Maybe we should take one from the internet of people who are watching. So maybe our moderator, Lindsay, can tell us a burning question that's on our very active Twitter stream.
Well, one question that we got during this panel was for Molly Palin. This is from Rachel Banks. So regarding your work with peer discomfort of expressions of grief, do you think that there's an overall trend against feelings?
Yeah, I do. Because I think that what ends up happening on Facebook and what people talked about is that there was this general, making comments that were very generic, like, rest in peace, we'll always remember you. I didn't know you that well, but I'm sorry to hear that you've died, and things like that. And people then who I spoke with talked about how, well, that person didn't know them very well. Like, they didn't really have a voice in who they were as a person and things like that. So there was this general, like, I need to show that I'm part of this grieving community and that I feel something, but I think in doing that, it wasn't maybe a valid feeling that this person was having.
But I actually think, I'm wondering with young people, is that oftentimes that I'm wondering if you saw different kinds of expression across mediums. So I know that Rachel Banks is the co-creator of GIF Pop. Where are you, Rachel? In the audience still? Hey, so, and one thing that we're seeing, in a lot of our research with young people is that if you spend a lot of time on Tumblr, young people are actually very expressive through other ways. Like, they actually can express grief more easily through GIFs. So do you see that happening where maybe it's not as easy for verbal expression, but that they're using other forms of medium to express it? And if so, does Facebook permit that kind of media engagement?
I think that they probably are going to other places. I think that for young adults who are using Facebook, they don't necessarily see it as a place to express grief. I think it is more about remembering this person, but then they look to it to express grief because they feel like they have to, and they feel like they need to say something to be part of that community. And I didn't look at other medium, or across other media, like on Tumblr or things like that. People would talk about that, and people oftentimes brought up instances of memorializing someone physically, so letting balloons up into the air with their class when a peer died or something like that. And those instances for those people, it was more, I guess, a better way for them to grieve, but still grieving on Facebook or expressing something was a necessary thing for them.
Great. So let's take a question from the audience. I'm going to pass them. Oh, this is not accessible. You have to walk all the way up here and identify yourself, and we'll see you if you want to ask a question. Or if you want to write it on a piece of paper, I will ask it for you. Great, we have a question. Matthew Clare of Harvard University.
I really enjoyed all these. My questions are mostly for Timothy and Molly, I think. One is a really quick particular methodological question. I think this is something that's come up in my own research, but you sort of mentioned the non-representative nature of your data, and obviously that makes sense, but I'm curious how you all both sort of sampled or found your respondents, your 20 respondents. Like, how did you find people who were commemorating people online, on Facebook, and things like that, and looking at their death? And then also, how did you come across these different sort of websites, and how did you know to even stumble upon like that guy, or Martin or whatever? And the second question I have is a little bit more about what you mentioned at the end about ethical nature of sort of commemorating and suicide notes online. And I'm wondering more as a researcher for both of you, if you ever have any sense of moral angst or ethical concerns with regard to people who obviously are public and they are online, so there are no IRB concerns. However, there may be concerns if you write this up and talk about the more familial concerns and their social networks and things like that for people who are still alive.
Someone had to ask the IRB question, didn't they? And it had to be academic. Sure. Let's keep these questions short because we have about 5 minutes, and so we want to get through the next question.
So really simply, I found 20 participants when I went around to different classes of undergrads and basically explained my research project and said that I wanted to speak with people who hadn't specifically experienced this. And it was just like a pre-screening process in order to find people who, to me, said that they had expressed grief. I didn't press them on what that meant to them, but I wanted them to self-identify as grieving or having a friend on Facebook that had died that they thought they could talk about. So it was really simple in that way. And what was the second part of the question?
IRB.
I specifically didn't want to look at people's profiles for that reason. So I wanted people to talk about their own friends, and then I just anonymized them in my data, their friends that they talked about and the participants' names. I think there's so many ethical questions about all of the things that are going on Facebook and death, and so yeah, I just kept everything anonymous for the time being. But
so you didn't actually go to their profiles and add them any of that stuff?
No, I didn't add people who are deceased or people who I spoke with. I only interviewed them in person. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Initially, I maybe thought it would be easier than it was to find the suicide notes. I went to mydeathspace.com because I had run into that just kind of randomly and put suicide note as the search term and sadly, I mean, this is a very macabre project for sure, but a few came up that the notes were still around on, so they went in the sample. And the Martin-Manley story and a couple other things, I mean, a lot of times these are newsworthy events, and so, Googling and finding the names of people who'd committed suicide and left an online note led me to, finding the note. Oftentimes it was that people captured the note and saved it after the site went down when these things were on social networking sites. But a lot of these were people's blogs that were specifically, hosted or paid up for a long time after they died. So, it took a while to get to 40. I felt like that was kind of as much as I could find.
How long did it take you?
I mean, 3 days of pretty hard, just doing this.
Okay.
Well,
you're gonna say 3 years or something.
No, God. Well, look, 3 days of doing nothing but this felt like a long time anyway. As far as the ethical questions, yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of puzzling over that, but for a lot of these cases, certainly the people whose names I specifically mentioned, I mean, they wanted their notes to be public, they wanted their story to be heard. Another guy I didn't mention, wrote a 1900-page, kind of academic tome called Suicide Note, which is, sort of this like exploration of nihilism and sociobiology, where he arrives at this conclusion that he needs to kill himself to. In any case, these people seem to want notoriety through the act, so it almost felt less ethical to hide their names. But that was an easy decision here, because I'm only talking about a few of them. As far as going forward for the cases where these things were made public, all of their names were, again, like you said, in the IRB. They're public. They're in news stories. But for younger cases, it does feel a little ghoulish, so I haven't really figured out what to do about that in terms of publishing anything with this research.
Especially as younger people, where their friends are still grieving them, as you can see through Molly's research.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
might be some interesting co-collaborative work to do there. All right, let's take the next question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Carol Squires from the International Center of Photography, and I have a question also for Molly and Tim. What was the role, if anything, of the photograph in the research that you did?
Great, let's keep it very short.
Yeah, just very briefly, people talked about how they looked back at people's photographs to remember them, and that they found comfort in looking at those photographs that people had left. And they also talked about uploading photos of them and how people would post something and include a photo of them from that moment and talk about a specific story and say, I remember this day with you, whatever, and share their memory through a photograph, but it would often be accompanied by text. I think it's really interesting on Facebook because there is that element of photography as opposed to going to somebody's grave. That's a very blatant, you're looking at a grave marker, you're not looking at a picture of them. So yeah, it was definitely something that I considered.
I mean, some of the sites that I saw that I posted up here had kind of a few pictures of the person and their friends or something like that, or their family. Manley's site had a tremendous amount of photographs, grainy old black and white things from when he was a child. But mainly I was looking at text and the rhetoric around there, partly because then if I only focus on photos, that would be a smaller, even smaller subset of the pages that seem to really deal with that stuff. But there was some interesting stuff going on in a few of them.
Great. I think we have room for one last question, so whoever runs to the mic first gets to ask it. Kind of not fair, because she's right really close, so.
Hi, this is kind of a question for the panel, but maybe more specifically to Tim and Molly, but also kind of contingently to Lesley. I see there's some kind of correspondence between Lesley's proposition that kind of a critique you offer of a lot of social theory that posits a kind of totalizing effect on the subject, and this woeful kind of going on record even after death that Molly and Tim explore. And I wonder if you can even think about situating that type of desire to publicize or kind of continue to kind of account for yourself, even if it's online, post-death, within this kind of larger, I guess, tendency to think about social theory itself as kind of having this totalizing effect on the subject. This might be kind of almost an instance of that type of, to a certain degree in sympathy to that kind of theory, but I wonder if there's a critique to that could be offered through your...
So let's have Lesley answer with 30 seconds.
Okay, right, no pressure there. I think, from my point of view, one of the things that I didn't talk about so much today is I think another effect of that data is to undermine typological categorizations, which are rife in educational research and policy. And I think that's a lot to do with trying to fix the subject, sort subjects out, and in a sense kind of create an illusion of fixity, I think, which people find quite comforting. And very often these discourses are extremely benign. So they don't seem to be amenable to critique. So I think there is a relationship there, I think, that you're drawing out. Is that 30 seconds? I'll stop there. But yeah, maybe we can talk some more about that, because it's a really interesting point.
I mean, I think to a certain extent, even, trying to classify these and put them in categories felt a little unnatural, and it's just kind of falling back on being trained as a sociologist, and we group and categorize and stuff. So, I mean, in one way, it would just to kind of do a more narrative genre-based work might feel more fair to the nuances of what my research subjects, for lack of a better word, are doing. But as far as linking that up to the, criticism, it does seem like what Molly and I are seeing maybe is a little bit of you know, there's a lot of research about how death got ghettoized in cemeteries, and then people move online to make it meaningful again, but it's almost becoming like compulsory now, and that may be equally problematic, so I don't really have an answer, but that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Tim, for that great response.